right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our educational series on all things biotech and life sciences. Prior to delving into the topic of discussion for today, Alzheimer's, the coming crisis, I wanted to do a short introduction. My name is Rob Anton. I'm the president and partner at Next Edge Capital. With us today is Eden Rahim, portfolio manager of the Next Edge Biotech and Life Sciences Opportunities Fund. Eden's been involved in money management for over 25 years as a portfolio manager, hedge fund manager, and is focused in a sector that he's truly passionate about, biotech. Eden's a regular guest speaker and industry expert on BNN, as well as a contributor to many industry sources, articles, and a speaker at numerous healthcare conferences. The Next Edge Biotech and Life Sciences Opportunities Fund provides a unique, well-defined process for investing in public biotech and life sciences companies with a focus on the winners, cures, and breakthroughs of tomorrow. We believe the building blocks are set, whereby the sector is entering a period of accelerated breakthroughs and discoveries, higher success rates, a more accommodating regulatory environment, and as a result, vast wealth creation to those investors that are participating in the sector. At the same time, also providing an altruistic benefit of saving lives through shareholder-funded R&D and providing better quality of life solutions to all humankind. The fund is structured as an alternative mutual fund, probably better known as a liquid alternative. It's available to everyone, charges a 0% management fee, only a performance fee, strongly aligning our interests with investors and further backing our outlook on this industry going forward. Our discussion will last approximately 20 to 30 minutes, and then we will take time to answer any questions. If you do have questions, you can answer them or you can type them into the Q&A function on your screens. Although one of the focuses of the fund is on investing in companies that are trying to develop a cure for Alzheimer's, we will not be answering any questions on individual holdings in Alzheimer's specifically. However, a significant portion of this time will be spent discussing the science behind it and where we believe there holds to be promise. So as I was preparing for this seminar today, I was thinking the last thing that we likely need to talk about over the past year is yet another crisis. However, it is something that is or will, impact us all, whether it's our friends, our family, or our colleagues. We will have to deal with it. As you can see from the slide, 747,000 Canadians are currently living with Alzheimer's or a form of dementia. 1 in 5 Canadians are experiencing or have experienced caring for someone living with dementia. 44 million people around the globe are living with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. 25,000 people are diagnosed with a form of dementia every single year in Canada. This is a disease that's, impacting women actually to a larger extent than males, whereby over 65% of those diagnosed with dementia are over this age of 65, that are women. 1 in 4 seniors over the age of 85 have been diagnosed with dementia already. And this problem, the Alzheimer's problem is expected to grow. That number in Canada is, by, 2030, another, decade, less than a decade from now, is expected to grow to over 900,000 people. And then the US by 2050 to over 12 million people. With that, I will now pass this over to my colleague, Eden Rahim, who's prepared some slides to walk you through what Alzheimer's is, where we are today, and where we're going. Over to you, Eden.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. We think that this is a supremely topical issue. It's not 6 degrees of separation, it's 2 degrees of separation. We each know someone that has succumbed to Alzheimer's, or we know someone that knows someone that has succumbed to Alzheimer's. We're definitely in a crisis right now. And while things have been bleak to this point as far as drugs developed and so on. We're here to say that we're probably at the cusp because the wheels are in motion to elicit a significant number of developments in the years ahead. We will cover several things. We will take a fairly broad deep dive into Alzheimer's and try to give you as complete an understanding as possible regarding how we got here, what are the available drugs, what's in development, and significant changes that are underway as far as a regulatory environment to favor the development of future therapies that could address this crisis, and how the bar has been lowered for companies that are doing so to correct the errors of the past that has really hindered these companies from bringing therapies to market. And finally, we'll focus on the sort of investments that we think are available. One of the virtuous aspects of what we focus on is that we invest in companies that are focused on either treating chronic diseases or saving lives. And that's really the bottom line. And as Rob mentioned, it's shareholder-funded R&D. Shareholders bear the risk of developing these therapies. They bring it to market. And we're in a uniquely positioned period in time where the unmet need for Alzheimer's is so considerable. I think Rob mentioned there's almost 6 million people in North America that have succumbed to it. And there is no disease-modifying treatment available. There will be in the next 3 to 5 years. And we're invested in some of the companies we think that will achieve that. So this is a quick glimpse of what the normal brain and the Alzheimer's brain looks like. And the Alzheimer's brain, it's basically due to dying nerve cells. And the cells die, they become encumbered with the buildup of two things. As the nerve cells die, they tangle and they create something called tau tangles. The other thing that happens is plaques develop, amyloid beta plaques develop in the brain. And as we will delve into in more detail later on, the great debate is, what is the cause and what is the effect? Are the plaques and the tangles a consequence of something that's happening, or are they the cause of what we have come to know about Alzheimer's? As we all know, Alzheimer's gestates for decades prior to when we actually show clinical symptoms, and that really complicates treatment or developing of treatments for Alzheimer's. And that understanding is what has prompted the FDA to really reconsider what prior standards were for developing therapies. The pathology of Alzheimer's is very complex. With some indications, it's a single gene, like cystic fibrosis, some cancers, some rare diseases. It's a single gene that's responsible. And as we look at in more detail later on, really this is multi-genetic. There are many, many genes implicated. And we're not sure what the triggers are necessarily. It could be epigenetic factors or so on, environment. We don't know. And but we do know many of the significant genes that are implicated. And that in itself is a big win at this point, because it helps us in developing therapies going forward. There are mutations in certain genes, and how those genes express, how the proteins fold as a result of those expressions, that adds to the complication of developing therapies for Alzheimer's. One really bleak stat about Alzheimer's is that the only drugs ever approved for Alzheimer's are symptomatic relief drugs. There is no disease-modifying drugs that's ever been approved. And we'll go into detail as to why that has been and why that will change in the years ahead. So the last drug approved was Namenda back in 2003, 18 years ago. And we'll take a look at some of the approved drugs. But again, it's all symptomatic relief. There are about 4 or 5 drugs that are approved, but really there's only 2 mechanisms of action that they target, but none changes the trajectory of the disease pathology. There are even some large biopharmas, because of the failure rate that in developing disease-modifying drugs, they've just exited. Their neuroscience programs focus on 80 altogether. Companies like Pfizer, Glaxo, AstraZeneca, because they were spending billions of dollars on R&D programs with no end. We think that 1 or 2 wins in the next year or two, which is very possible, could significantly change that and the amount of R&D dollars that flow back towards Alzheimer's. One of the major problems that has contributed to effectively the 100% failure rate in disease-modifying therapies for Alzheimer's is the FDA's requirement of a dual endpoint. Cognition and function both have to hit statistical significance in large, 2 phase 3 trials. They treated Alzheimer's exactly as they treated every other indication, except for the dual endpoint, which is, very strange because most other indications only require 1 endpoint to be proven. This is the elephant in the room. As you can see that while progress has been made in other indications over the past decade, you can see what's going on with mortality due to Alzheimer's over the past decade. And there's nothing that is unfortunately going to change that other than intervention from breakthrough therapies. So as I mentioned, the only drugs approved for Alzheimer's are symptomatic relief. And there are basically 2 mechanisms that they target. So the first mechanism is in Alzheimer's, when your brain cells die, they increasingly produce less acetylcholine esterase. And so what acetylcholine esterase is basically a brain messenger that allows cells to communicate. And as brain cells die, you have less and less of that. So what the symptomatic relief drugs do is they try and slow down the loss of acetylcholine esterase by inhibiting an enzyme that breaks that down. And so by slowing the breakdown of ACE, you're hoping to preserve. But unfortunately, that solution is akin to, you think about water flowing down a bathtub. And you put your fingers over the hole in the bathtub to slow the outflow of water. That's basically what these drugs do. The other drug that was approved is memantine. And what they do is they actually promote glutamate, which is another messenger in the brain to allow cells to communicate. So again, the mechanism is pretty much the same. And the last approved drug was memantine back in 2003. The dominant drug in the class, the ACE inhibitor, is Aricept or donepezil, which was a Pfizer drug that was approved, I think, about 25 years ago. But they're all generic now. And this is just a glimpse of the universe of drugs. The approval about 6 or 7 years ago was really just a combination of the 2 existing drugs, but it wasn't a new drug at all. Again, most of these are generic. They still do substantial sales because they are the only drugs available to treat patients and try and control the symptoms of Alzheimer's. So we're completely reevaluating how trials have been done in Alzheimer's at this point to be less of a hurdle to the success of future drugs in development. So one of the aims and one of the insights that's been developed is that to treat Alzheimer's, you have to treat it early when it's pre-symptomatic. So we have certain benchmarks that practitioners use to clinically diagnose Alzheimer's. But ideally, what you want to do is find biomarkers, things that could indicate that there is a risk of Alzheimer's in the future, rather than waiting for clinical, cognitive and functional evidence that the disease, that you've already been subjected to it. So by treating symptomatically, what you're hoping to do is it buys time until future drugs are developed, which they will be under the new landscape. Future drugs can be developed. It buys you time, which is what, when you succumb to Alzheimer's, it's your most precious commodity. And there are certain changes that are in place, and we'll get into more detail a little later on as to why. But, over the last couple of years, the FDA has had a change of mind as far as Alzheimer's trials. So as I mentioned, it was the only real indication that had to prove two things, had two primary endpoints, cognition and function. Well, now you can gain approval based on one endpoint, and especially in an earlier phase of Alzheimer's disease. The other thing that can happen, you can increasingly use a surrogate endpoint as acceptable. Because again, you remember, Alzheimer's evolves very slowly over time. So you don't want to wait until you have clear cognition and functional deficits to act. You want to be able to detect factors that are in place early. So when I say surrogate biomarker, think about something like hypertension. In hypertension, you measure blood pressure. That's a biomarker of hypertension. With prostate cancer, you measure PSA. That is a marker. With glaucoma, you'll do something like intraocular pressure, and so on. And these are things that we accept. For diabetes, I think you can use the glucose measurements, and so these are telltale signs that something is afoot. And so we're looking for biomarkers that we can use in Alzheimer's that are highly predictive, and we'll go into more detail on that later on. One of the other changes that's afoot. Combo therapies. So remember I mentioned that Alzheimer's, unlike some other indications, is a multigenetic cause. There's so many contributing factors that have to coalesce to result in that. So it's going to be like a combo therapies. Like in the early days of HIV, there were combo therapies. With cancer, we will use multiple drugs for some indications, and that's what it's probably going to be like. And I think the FDA has become cognizant of that. So it wants to buy time so that all these different therapies can come to market that target different aspects. One could target function, one could target cognition, instead of one drug having to succeed at both of those. So I think the wheels are in motion. I think while it may not seem that way from where we stand in biotechnology, we can see through to the other side. We know what's happening, we know what's coming. And in an instrumental, a pivotal aspect of this is a reforming of the FDA approval process for AD, as we've hinted at, and that is a major de-risking event in the development of therapies for Alzheimer's going forward. It lowers the cost of capital. Biogen has spent $2.5 billion. One company has spent $2.5 billion on its 2 phase 3s for aducanumab. Well, I mean, that is just not sustainable. And so by the reform that the FDA has undertaken for Alzheimer's, we can lower the cost of capital. We can allow a lot more companies to target this indication now. So there are 4 key genes that we know that play a prominent role in contributing to Alzheimer's. Obviously, the dominant one is chromosome 21. So mutations in a chromosome 21 creates abnormal amyloid precursor protein, APP, which ultimately is responsible for the buildup of plaque in the brain. And so that is dominant. How do we also know that? Is that sadly in Down syndrome, where people have 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of 2, they almost all, 100%, have the buildup of plaque in their brain by the age of 40, and in their 50s, most are already displaying symptoms of Alzheimer's. And so that's a confirming element as to why this mutation in chromosome 21 plays such an important role. Another big role is the abnormal presenilin 1 and 2 due to mutations in chromosome 14 and 1. And effectively 100% of Alzheimer's patients have the wild type version of these 2 proteins. The other one that many of you might be aware of is the allele E4 on ApoE, which is a mutation on chromosome 19. And so that is highly predictive of your risk for Alzheimer's. So if you have 1 copy of the ApoE4 allele, you have 3 times the risk of getting Alzheimer's. If you have the ApoE4 allele on both your chromosome 19, your risk increases 8-fold. And so the mechanism behind the mutation of that is that it impacts a key neuro messenger in the brain-derived neurotrophic factors. And so by reducing that, obviously, it impairs the brain's ability to function in the face of Alzheimer's. I won't go into detail about these, but these are other genes that are also strongly implicated. Recent years, there have been a couple of biotech companies that have now targeted the TREM2 gene, so that is going up in importance. They feel that because it's really impacting the inflammation, the healing of inflammation in the brain, to remove the amyloid beta plaque from the brain, that it also contributes. It may not be a cause, but if you can activate the correct production of TREM2, then perhaps the brain's ability to remove the amyloid beta plaque will improve. And that's their hypothesis as to taking this angle. The beauty is we're in an environment where there are many angles coming at Alzheimer's right now, but several relatively new companies that are targeting different approaches. It may not seem that way, but it's a time to be excited. And you don't have to worry about this. It's just what it is. I want to show that there are essentially about 120 agents that are currently in clinical trials for Alzheimer's. About half of them are focused on disease modification. A quarter of them are in phase 3, half are in phase 2, and a quarter in phase 1. But it's a wild west in some ways. We focus on a really much smaller subset of the agents that are in trials right now. But it includes the likes of elderberry juice and grapeseed extract. So we're not going to go down that path, but that's just how it is. But there are some really interesting targets that have begun to enter clinical trials right now that I think it will be exciting to see the results of those in the years ahead. So this is a relatively important slide because what it is, these are different approaches that companies are targeting in the Alzheimer's pathology. And there are all these mechanisms of action that they feel that by impacting and by reversing mutations, effective mutations, and so on, it could all be contributing. And again, as I mentioned, no single drug will be the successful agent. It will be a contribution of different agents at different phases. It's a long pathway in Alzheimer's. Some agents may work better at the earliest stage, some at the mid stage, some at the late stage, some at the pre-symptomatic stage, and others may work better in combination with other agents. But the dominant approach is using antibodies. Antibodies to target plaque removal, antibodies to break down tau, antibodies to bind to low molecular weight toxic oligomers, base inhibition, as I mentioned, TREM2, which also could go into the neuroinflammation box. There are other agents that are coming because essentially Alzheimer's is a protein misfolding problem. And, again, there are different approaches. Antisense is coming, RNAi is taking out Alnylam and companies like that, proteostasis. And then there are other companies that are focused on regenerating neurotropic factors, basically brain regenesis. So there are agents, further up in a cascade that get impaired, like you mentioned BDNFs and so on. If production of those growth factors can be stimulated, then perhaps you can re-stimulate the growth of brain cells and rebuilding of networks. And again, that's the beauty of what's unfolding here. There's so many different ways. On the top right, there are even ways where people are treating Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes, because the impact of type 2 diabetes is that it impairs the vasculature in the brain. And if that can, if you can use some of the agents that's out there, like Novo Nordisk is testing their GLP-1 in Alzheimer's, then perhaps by strengthening the blood vessels in the brain, you can improve the flow to and the flow out of the brain. So again, some amazing different approaches coming at this. And in a bizarre way, I have some acquaintances that that are part of this longevity program, and while they're healthy and they're not type 2 diabetes, they take drugs like metformin every single day because of that fear. So, as I mentioned, there are biomarkers can play an essential and important role going forward. So the existing biomarkers that are out there, the standard one that is often used to determine who are allowed into an Alzheimer's trial are PET scans. But again, it's invasive. It's very expensive, and because it's looking at plaque in the brain. Again, at the earliest stages of Alzheimer's, patients typically don't have plaque already built up in the brain, so it's not reliable that way. We're along a company that is developing that's looking at picking up tau protein, which increases 200 to 300% in the blood and in cerebral spinal fluid. And we think that could be an inclusion criteria. That this company used that as part of the inclusion criteria in the recently reported Eli Lilly trials, the Trailblazer trial, and it played a pivotal role in enrollment and the diagnosis of Alzheimer's patients. So we think that's one other exciting way. The other things that are coming about is, again, cerebral spinal fluid, looking at it, because what happens is amyloid beta protein drops about 50%, tau protein jumps about 200 or 300% in cerebral spinal fluid. So that's one way of detecting early. But again, it's highly invasive. There has to be better ways of doing it. It's not something that's easily accessible to people to have. But at least in principle, we know, because that's there, better tests will be developed to be able to pick this up. MRI is a cheaper, easier way than PET scans because it's able to pick up hippocampal atrophy because it's measuring glucose changes. How much glucose is the brain consuming? As the brain deteriorates, it consumes less glucose because there's less functioning occurring. And so MRI can be used to measure things like that. But we think there are even more exciting, potentially blood-based biomarkers that are coming on the way. And I remember I mentioned earlier what a biomarker is. We use it in hypertension, we use it in prostate cancer, we use it in glaucoma, and so on. So one of the concerns that is often raised, and the FDA has raised, is would biomarkers lead to overdiagnosis? And the way I look at it is, well, given the situation that we have right now, overdiagnosis is better than underdiagnosis. And overdiagnosis is better because at least it's picking up more of what we've missed to this point. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It's a problem. It's not our biggest problem to deal with. So if there's overdiagnosis, it's better than underdiagnosis. So the ideal biomarker is something that is specific, it's sensitive, it's highly predictive, it is inexpensive. Ideally, you can measure it in blood or serum or urine, and it can detect the existing biomarkers that, tau and other agents of neurodegeneration that I mentioned earlier. One of the most interesting biomarkers to really emerge over the last few years, and there's been a lot of papers that's written, is a neurofilament light. And what happens is when axons break down, axons are the connections in brain cells that transfer messages. When that breaks down, it increases, neurofilament light increases. And so what happens is that as neurofilament light increases in a test, you realize there's more and more and more neurodegeneration that's going on. The unfortunate thing is not, and it's not really unfortunate, but I mean, in the case of Alzheimer's, is it's not highly specific for Alzheimer's because there are various forms. There's Parkinson's disease, there's ALS, and depending on these, the degree of neurodegeneration, rises along a curve on a chart. So you can see where the NFL measures to help determine, but at least it 100% picks up neurodegeneration, which is better than we've had before. And so it comes down to, now that we're looking at biomarkers that are targeting different things, one of the big debates in biotech and in AD therapies is that the dominant hypothesis out there has been the amyloid beta plaque hypothesis, which is plaques build up in the brain, and again, which comes first, the cart or the horse, and so does removing the plaque correlate with improvement in Alzheimer's? And not necessarily. There's been evidence of people that had plaque that never developed Alzheimer's disease, and there are those with very little plaque that do have Alzheimer's disease. So it's not a direct correlation. We think some of these biomarkers can help circumvent the difficulty of what we've used to this point, which is measure the plaque in the brain as a standard. So as I mentioned, the FDA has instituted certain reforms as to how Alzheimer's trials can be run. As I mentioned before, every other indication required one primary endpoint and a few secondary endpoints. Yet for AD, a drug had to prove both cognition and function and be statistically significant in both. And they're very different. While they might be causal relationships, they're measured very different, and treatment modalities impacted. And the things that we know now about the Alzheimer's pathology, the FDA has had an epiphany about that. So until then, this understanding of having to prove endpoints has contributed to 100% failure in disease-modifying agents. When we talk about these trials, paradoxically, companies had to demonstrate that there was a cognition benefit when they were targeting functional improvements, which it really doesn't make any sense now. And it's sad that so much money was spent having to prove both with no success. When I talk about cognition, we're talking about things like memory, language, reasoning, and function, of course, daily tasks, getting dressed, cooking, driving, things like that. So the FDA has basically had three epiphanies about what needs to change to enable the development of successful therapies in the years ahead. Epiphany number one is you have to treat pre-symptomatic people in order to alter the trajectory of how this disease progresses. By knocking the trajectory off course, you buy time for patients. And by buying time, they win time for therapies that will be developed. And they win time with their family and their loved ones. They can also gain approval on one single endpoint, one targeting cognition, one targeting function. They no longer have to prove two endpoints in two large phase 3 trials. So the previous standard of scale that they used to measure success was the ADAS-Cog. Well, there are limitations to that, highly subjective, and so on. So they've come up with new scales like the CDR-SB, and as Eli Lilly unveiled in its trailblazer trial, the IARDS, and so on. So the FDA is finding new and novel ways to be able to measure it's important for companies undertaking trials. But there are dilemmas as a result of these changes, in terms, as we hinted at in the past. For instance, in when you only have mild cognitive impairment and no functional impairment, how do you measure disease? Well, that's why I talked about all this confluence of different factors that are coming together that did not exist before. So, the FDA is much more open to accepting biomarkers, such as PET and measuring A beta and tau and so on, and perhaps even NFL as endpoints, because very early on, those are the only things that can truly measure disease and disease progression. And so the FDA is open to accepting that as an endpoint rather than being subject to an ADAS-Cog scale or something like that. But then as the disease progresses, you can now measure cognitive impairments, but you may still be very functional and you may not see any functional deficits at that point. So the FDA will consider a trial that only addresses cognitive impairment. You don't have to prove functional improvement in functional deficits at that point because it's not really material. And again, for a lot of you, this may not seem like a big deal, but it's a huge deal. This is really a fundamental shift into how therapies will develop, and it really overcomes, considerable deficits that existed to this point. And so there is reason to hope that a lot will change in the next 5 years in the landscape for Alzheimer's therapies. Now, again, with the final thing, when the disease has advanced and you have both functional and cognitive deficits, again, you in the past you'd have to produce 2 large phase 3 trials, each of which targeted 2 endpoints. But the FDA is now open to different scales of measurement. And again, I think things like trend towards progression, if you know a drug is really active. So for instance, you look at something like aducanumab, where in the eMERGE trial, it hit statistical significance. In the ENGAGE trial, it missed. The FDA may still be open to approving that because the FDA knows the drug works. It knows that there's a trend to benefit. It knows that it's changing the pathology. But it can't be that firm as it used to be. And so there is something afoot. There's something very different, and the FDA has really reformed how it's going to allow trials and decide on success or failure. So, as I hinted at already, the FDA has hinted that the FDA has indicated that in enrolling for trials, you must indicate the stage of AD. So you've broken it up into early, mid, and advanced stages, and what stage you think this patient might be at by the end of the trial. So these trials, the aducanumab trial lasted about 72 weeks. Lilly ran a trial that lasted 76 weeks. But you're enrolling patients at different stages. So from beginning to end, that's about 3 years. So you're now sort of expected to indicate what the stage of that patient might otherwise be with or without the drug. Biomarkers can be used as criteria for improvement, for inclusion, no longer subjective scores, because again, you can have a patient that is experiencing degradation of brain cells, but without having developed plaque. And so if you have a drug, an antibody, for instance, like aducanumab, that is targeting plaque in the brain, if you're not carrying plaque, then the drug's not going to work. It's not going to bind to plaque in the brain. And so what's the point? And so by doing this, a company can be really much more accurate in the kind of patient enrolled in the trial that's really amenable to the target that they're going after. And no matter what, whether it's TREM, whether it's tau or A beta or something like that. So again, this all contributes to de-risking companies that are developing drugs in the space, and that's really important for where we are. So as I hinted at, the FDA is much more open. So when Biogen reported phase 1b data several years ago, and it was very good data, the FDA said, skip phase 2, go directly into phase 3. You see, that was unthinkable for an indication. The FDA will do things like that for very, very tiny indications where the mortality rate is high. But for an indication as big as Alzheimer's, that's unthinkable. That's a real change in philosophy of the FDA. With Roche Genentech's crenezumab, even though it didn't hit stat sig in phase 2, they were allowed to go into phase 3. And they're targeting patients with the ApoE4 allele. And so, that could be very effective. We might have success out of that coming up because the FDA was open-minded enough to allow that trial to advance and not abort it there and have hundreds of millions of dollars flushed down the toilet again. So we're going to conclude with sort of a view of how all this comes together from the point of view of investors. And so, there are multiple approaches to investing in development of therapies and treatments and detection for Alzheimer's disease. And really, it is early days because the failure rate has been so significant to this point. But yet we've had this watershed event from the FDA that completely changes the investment landscape. So we're highly focused on this area. We, on Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, ALS, and other CNS indications, because we think there's a fundamental shift in the de-risking of companies targeting these areas of tremendous unmet need, immediate and huge unmet need. And so there are different approaches. From the slide we showed earlier, and the one segment, there were companies who were focused on repurposing existing drugs or modifying small molecule drugs for symptomatic relief. That's one approach. There'll be opportunities there, of course. There will be other companies that are focused on the ancillary effects of Alzheimer's, such as hallucinations and movement disorders. There'll be, there's a pressing need for that. That is a significant side effect of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and Lewy body. And again, we're focused primarily on disease-modifying drugs. We think that's the holy grail. That's where the largest unmet need is, and that's where the blue sky is. Is if any company is able to show that they're able to modify the trajectory of deterioration of Alzheimer's disease, there is a vast market waiting for them, vast immediate market waiting for them. The unmet need is huge, and it's immediate. We think there's a significant opportunities for developers of biomarkers and tests associated with these biomarkers, because again, the move will be to diagnose Alzheimer's early and then start de-risking and then getting people that carry risk of developing Alzheimer's, getting them on treatments early to alter the trajectory of this. There are other things that, other marginal things that are out there. We had an investment in an AI-driven company that has ways of measuring cognitive deterioration, and we're using you as your baseline. It's not using something else. You are your baseline. So it measures your cognitive changes with tremendous accuracy, against your standard. And so I think investors have not woken up. Companies investing in Alzheimer's are still largely out of favor. Over the years, we've had a few small victories and also a lot of heartbreak. Some of our companies have failed in trials, and others, have made advances and so on. But we think that there's a marginal line that we have crossed. And the landscape for investing in developing therapies for Alzheimer's is significantly different in the next 5 years than it was in the last 5 years. But, again, because there is considerable risk associated with, single company risk with these companies, is, we think the way to do it is through a diversified approach. But the returns for those that succeed will be, and that's sort of the basis of our case. I'll try to cover as much as we can of the landscape of developing therapies for Alzheimer's, where we are, where we're going, what is required for us to get to where we are going, and why this time it is different. Thank you.
Eden, that was excellent. Obviously a very complex subject, and you pretty much covered it from A to Z. So that was great. As I mentioned, as you probably realized from the last 40 minutes or so, this is, from the discussion, Alzheimer's is a very complex sector. Eden, you did a great job of explaining it. And we truly feel that this is something that investors shouldn't be doing themselves. We prefer to buy the fund. It's one of the reasons why we set up the fund, is to, have expert money management that understands these types of sectors, breakthroughs, and the science behind it, in order to properly invest in these types of areas. There's a massive unmet need in this sector, in Alzheimer's, as well as many other areas that the fund is investing in. but there is a big promise, for the future, and a tremendous, tremendous opportunity for those companies that show progress. It's not a winner-take-all proposition in this sector. There's definitely room for many winners with exponential upside. The fund currently, as Eden mentioned, owns a number of these positions, which we believe hold promise in the space. If you'd like to learn more about our fund and how we invest in the biotech and life sciences space, please reach out to your regional sales team representative, and they can provide you with further details and discuss the broader fund mandate with you. You can also find out more information, on our website at nextedgecapital.com. If anyone has any questions, please type them in. We do have a few in the queue here, or definitely one in the queue, Eden. So I'll start off with
Sure.
a couple. PET and MRI are costly. So do you have thoughts on computerized cognitive assessments and their potential use alongside blood-based biomarkers for broader screening?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I definitely think that there is room for that. We were invested in a small company that actually developed that. I had the CEO on my panel, the Cantech panel, a couple of years ago. I think it's very exciting. They're based in the UK. I think AI will play a role in learning different symptoms and quantifying, because what you want is something that's really quantifiable, where you are the baseline. It's against what you are, so it's measuring these changes. So I agree completely that there is a huge role for that, along with blood-based biomarkers. And I think that will be included as secondary endpoints in trials going forward.
Excellent. There's no further questions here, Eden. I maybe have one or a few that I can hit on. So you had mentioned there's 128 companies or types of things in various stages of trials. Some maybe not trials, or how do you kind of keep track of some of these, or where do you focus, or is there an easy screen that kind of brings that 128 down to 50? Or how do you go about navigating this universe?
This is our spreadsheet. We've got every trial, every indication, targeting what. So that's an example of what we do and how we monitor these trials. So again, we watch them closely, but we have an idea as to the ones that really have significant science behind them. There are obviously some that are opportunistic. You throw spaghetti at the wall and hope something sticks. There are a lot of those, so we dismiss a lot of those. Maybe one will hit, but we'll probably miss that one. And we're focused more on the deep science companies that are really targeting areas that are coming to the surface and we're becoming aware of right now as important areas to target. Perfect.
Another question that came up here, OCT and fundus photography, will they play a role in screening?
Unfortunately, I don't know. I don't know about that.
Okay. That concludes our questions, Eden. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us for this month. We'll be doing these monthly, go forward. Our next educational session in a month from now will be kind of focused on, research and development and kind of the whole merger and acquisition type theme that, we're somewhat playing in the fund as well, with regards to, we believe a lot of the big companies need to buy and acquire a lot of the small mid caps in order to beef up their R&D process. So we'll get into more specifics on that next month. So thank you for joining, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.